to do one thing for somebody else with no strings attached. And if I could get them to invest energy in just that one step, it made them feel so good that that introduction of self-worth begins to banish the depression, because ultimately depression comes from a total flat-out feeling that you aren't worth anything. And it's one of the most common disorders in American society today, particularly in the suburbs, particularly women in the suburbs. Just millions and millions of people who are depressed and are having difficulty making it. We think we can provide an experience for children that will preclude that from happening. And it'll become clear the means by which we propose to do that as we go through the next 3 or 4 days. But that gets at your question basically, I think, George. Now, that's not to say, incidentally, that Freud didn't uncover lots of important insights. I think he did. And it's just the conception of some of these things didn't have necessarily. Well, let me give you just a quick example. One of Freud's first principles is that all neuroses is derived from the repression of infantile sexual drives. Now, that gets you into a very foolish position. Because if somebody comes to you with a problem, in analyzing it, you must find what sexual impulse got repressed. And Freud said if you couldn't find one, you had to make up one. In fact, he says in his writings, he says, if you have a woman who cannot point to an incident in her life in which her father tried to rape her, you must presuppose it anyway.
That's awful.
Well, and the man has the same problem, you know. He's got his dad had to come after him with a butcher knife to castrate him. And I just know my dad never did. And I'm just not about to let some psychiatrist try to talk me into it. It just doesn't, I mean, it went too far, you see. But that's what happens if your first principle is untenable. And adhering to that first principle made Carl Gustav Jung leave Freud, made Adler leave Freud. It made lots of people leave Freud. See? But don't forget, Freud practiced in the Victorian era, where there was enormous amounts of sexual repression. And therefore, a lot of people got unrepressed after they visited him. And they got better. Nowadays, I think you need to go to somebody to get repressed. It's gone overboard now. We don't need any Freudians around. We need some other people to do a little repressing here. Put some banks around the river here. Okay. Number 2, I've already elaborated on in this little quote here. The third one emphasizes the same thing. Oh, I tell you, the way Whitehead writes is something. The task of philosophy is to penetrate beyond the more obvious accidents to whose principles of existence, which are presupposed in dim consciousness, are involved in the total meaning of seeming clarity. Now you see, when you're right there before that child, I tell you, I know from watching people work with children, it is easy to see them as objects who can be manipulated and caused to do things. And that there will be no penetration beyond their appearances. And it's interesting, a child who has an adult relate to them on that basis simply will not be very attractive. because this whole reality is missing. An adult who relates to a child responsibly, in the sense that they're going to require some things, but also give some choice and freedom, is the best combination. If you have an adult that relates to the child only as a pal, and therefore doesn't require anything of the child, will also be doing a disservice because the child isn't able to take on all that. You know, parents who say, well, I'll let my child decide what he's going to do and what he won't do, and I'll just be a pal. Well, they've just abandoned parenthood, in my opinion. If living 25 to 30 years longer than the child hasn't provided you with some knowledge and experience that puts you in a better position to help this child make some decisions than the child represents by himself, then you oughtn't to have been a parent in the first place. There is some worth in having lived 40 years, or 30 years, or 25 years, that puts you in an advantageous position when it comes to helping the child. And it's irresponsible not to make use of that, you see. Well, these other statements are grist for your intellectual mill. They all focus primarily on Whitehead's statements about the nature of philosophy itself. And now I want to just examine briefly a few of Whitehead's statements, not about philosophy, but about experience. In other words, this is the philosophy itself now, disclosing the nature of reality. And these don't come in any particular order, but I just want to get you to sense the flavor of Whitehead's thought when he jumps from his cosmology down to the world of education. Here's number one. The paradox which wrecks so many promising theories of education is that the training which produces skill is so very apt to stifle imaginative zest. You get the picture. This drill-rote learning, which is designed to give a child a skill, at the same time snuffs out imagination. Skill demands repetition, but imaginative zest is tinged with impulse. Up to a certain point, each gain in skill opens new paths for the imagination, and that's where the secret lies from an Anissa point of view. Children must be given skills, because without them, they are crippled. They are not really free. On the other hand, the context within which the child comes to learn the skill must be not for the sake of learning the skill or just pleasing the teacher, but because it opens a door to perpetual becoming. It gives him the power to be better in charge of what he's going to become. Now, we have some ideas about how to help do that, and we'll talk about those in the next few days. Now, that idea, this paradox, this kind of duality you see all through Whitehead's philosophy. Here's another expression of it. The art of progress is to preserve order amid change, and to preserve change amid order. Anissa's way of saying that is flexible structure. The classroom must be structured, but it cannot be rigidly so. It must be flexibly structured. In other words, dynamic equilibrium. There is got to be somewhere between chaos, which is random organization, and rigid static structure. And yet there must be balance. And that balance we see as dynamic equilibrium that preserves order amidst change and preserves change amidst order. And you see all the way through his philosophy these kinds of balances. In education, you double the rate of progress of your pupils if you can fit their various studies together. This has to do with integration now of the curriculum. Instead of having it come fragmented at the child, geography here and math here and music here, and none of them are connected. He says, it is the very breath, they said, mankind is born for action. It is the very breath of his life that he should be doing something. The aim of education, therefore, is the marriage of thought and action. That action should be controlled by thoughts, and that thoughts should issue in action. Now, if you, I guess it was a whole year ago, last October, not quite a year ago, we were invited to present at an international conference on the improvement of university teaching. We were invited to project what an ENISA university would look like. And this was a wonderful opportunity for us to extrapolate in that direction. We'd already done some of it, but this provided the formal, benevolent pressure to do it. And we see as the key feature of a successful university program, and incidentally, that university program would begin much earlier in the life cycle from an ENISA point of view, because we think on the basis of all the information, research information we have tabulated, that a child who comes through the ENISA system will be ready for graduate study by the age of 15. So the university experience will come sooner, ultimately, given the way we think things can be organized. And the basis of that university system rests in part on this proposition, that action should be controlled by thoughts, and that thoughts should issue in action. And here's what's missing in the university. There is no provision for all the thinking to issue in action. We conceive of the ENISA University being a collection of scholars who are thinking about issues and problems facing mankind and organizing and carrying out tentative solutions. Let me give you an example. Take the energy crisis. Why shouldn't the minds of students be learning about the physical properties of energy and their sources, while at the same time engaged in projects designed to do something about it? One of the great sources of energy, if we can take Spencer's position that we were explaining a little earlier about motion and mass, if you look at the movement of the tides around the Earth, it represents enormous energy. The moon pulls the tides twice a day. If we built offshore dams, the moon would pull the ocean through turbines on those dams. And as soon as they got on this side, the moon would turn around and pull it through the turbines. All you have to do is turn the turbine around. And that movement of water back and forth would turn enough turbines to light the whole Earth endlessly with no pollution. Yes? Why don't we do it? I can't understand why we don't do it. We're sure spending a lot of money on such awful nonsense. Everybody's got tides. Everybody's got the moon. Now, I don't think anybody's going to do it, but by golly, if I'm around and we have the ENISA University, we're going to have a team of kids working on it. You can be sure. Now, won't that make life much more interesting? Yes, because action will issue from their thinking about the problem. Yes?
Someone is doing something like that, and I'm not sure about
good.
it.
Where is it?
In the North Sea, they're starting to work with.
Yeah.
They have
Yeah.
funding too.
They got funded?
Well,
No,
I
we've
don't
been
know if
screwed.
they're trying to, I don't know whether they've started.
Well, let me give you another idea then. We got lots of them. We'll never run out, you know. It's been found that the Sahara Desert at one time was a forest. And there are large subterranean rivers, largely from the melted snows of the Kilimanjaro Mountains and so on. But they're about 3,000 feet down, which is a long way to drill. There is the thesis that trees do not grow where it rains, but that it rains where trees grow. So that if you could get trees to grow in large enough numbers artificially, eventually it would come to rain there and keep the trees alive. The basic dynamic is a simple one. I'm always losing my tongue. You get trees to grow, and when warm winds blow against the trees, they hit them and go up, they condense, and then it rains. And there's been some studies about these convection currents and so on to give that some credence. Well, supposing you took 1 million youth on a reclamation project, youth who were interested in the soil sciences, in animal husbandry, in plant disease, and in botany. You could move all 1 million of them to the Sahara Desert. They could all get their degrees over a 4-year period, turning the Sahara Desert into the breadbasket of the world. The Sahara Desert is as big as the entire United States. Why not? Why have these students stuck all the time in libraries, hating the next exam that's coming up? Didn't you hate it when you were in it? It's just awful. Now, you have to have exams because you have to know whether or not you're accomplishing anything. But it's so much easier to see the effects of your accomplishment right out there, not on the paper that comes back from the professor, you see, but in what you're actually doing, you see. Well, we project the Anissa University, and even high school, mind you, or what would be the equivalent of high school, to be based largely on this pattern. That's going to take some community reorganization. But I don't think you can keep high school students in the next 50 years stuck in nice, neat rows, trying to cram all this information in without letting it issue in action. They have to have some action, so what do? Well, they poke the girl next to them, or they fight, or they fuss, or they blow off some steam in the athletic team. Well, why not have them engaged in solving real life problems confronting the community? We think that you ought to. You lose the organicity, the organismic nature of the system by just having children, particularly as they get older, sitting in seats. So this is going to be a basic proposition for our new approach. And you know what I predict? I predict we will have such an enormous enrollment compared to other universities that we'll just have them waiting in the wings trying to get in. He says, we are discovering that in schools you cannot do without genius. Genius of character, genius of insight, and genius of intellectual enthusiasm. Now, if you're not enthusiasm about thinking, then how in the world are you going to get a child interested in thinking? Authorities who want successful schools must see to it that the conditions in the teaching profession are those in which genius can thrive. Now, where did Malcolm go? He's an authority, right? You can quote this to him. It says that Whitehead says he must see to it that there are conditions that enable you all to thrive as geniuses. I'll be interested to see what he says. Listen to this one. You won't get interested in what you are doing unless you have some ideals before you, some hopes for the betterment of human society, some joy at making others happy, some courage in facing the obstacles to progress. Such ideals bear essentially upon your schoolwork. Ideals which are not backed by exact knowledge are mere fluffy emotion and often lead to disastrous action. Listen to this one. There can be nothing more destructive of true education than to spend long hours in the acquirement of ideas and methods which lead nowhere. That's why we say you should never have your Anissa kids involved in anything that doesn't lead somewhere. In other words, don't have them memorize the capitals of all the counties in Connecticut, because that leads exactly nowhere. They might need to know what a county seat is, and a county is, and then just tell them where they can find that information they need it. But don't ask them to memorize it. That's just taking up brain space. Where does it lead? It leads to possessing a useless piece of information for all intents and purposes. Now, if you had to be calling up every county seat every day, then it might be important for you to know them. But not everybody's going to need to. Whitehead says, it is fatal to all intellectual vitality. It produces, on the one hand, a sense of incompetence, of lack of grasp, and of inability really to penetrate to the true meaning of things, and on the other hand, by a natural revolt of the self-respecting intellect, it produces a distaste for ideas and a suspicion that they are all equally futile. Well, if you want to have your children grow up being suspicious that all ideas are futile, that'd be a terrible thing to do, in my opinion. Practical schoolmasters will tell you that the main structure of successful education is formed out of the accurate accomplishment of a succession of detailed tasks. That's why we're interested in sequence in the Anissa model. It is necessary to enforce this point at the very beginning of discussion and to keep it in mind throughout, because the enthusiasm of reformers so naturally dwells on what we may term the rhetoric of education. See, it's so easy to get up and say a whole lot of stuff that doesn't amount to a hill of beans. Turns out to be mere fluffy emotion, as Whitehead puts it. You really have to have your ducks in a row now if you're going to compete with a system that's been around for a couple of hundred years and had a chance to iron a few of the bugs out. He says, if we examine the cause, these are taken from all different kinds of books, so that's why they're a little disconnected. If we examine the cause of the educational dissatisfactions at the end of the last and at the beginning of this century, we shall find that it centers around the fact that the subjects in the curriculum were taught as incomplete fragments. As we think, we live. The mind is the crucible in which we fashion our purposes. The business of a university is the guidance of thought, its content of knowledge, its aesthetic apprehensions, and its activity of criticism. Here's one on individualizing instruction. The environment within which the mind is working must be carefully selected. It must, of course, be chosen to suit the child's stage of growth and must be adapted to individual needs. In a sense, it is an imposition from without, but in a deeper sense, it answers to the call of life within the child. Your character is developed according to your faith. This is the primary religious truth from which nobody can escape. First-hand knowledge is the ultimate basis of intellectual life. To a large extent, book learning conveys second-hand information, and as such can never arise to the importance of immediate practice. Our goal is to see the immediate events of our lives as instances of our general ideas. In other words, you need both, but don't have just one and not the other. Listen to this one. No man of science merely wants to know. He acquires knowledge to appease his passion for discovery. He does not discover in order to know. He knows in order to discover. The pleasure which art and science can give to toil is the enjoyment which arises from successfully directed intention. Also, it is the same pleasure which is yielded to the scientist and to the artist. here. Well, you can see I just have pages and pages. The only avenue towards wisdom is by freedom in the presence of knowledge, but the only avenue towards knowledge is by discipline in the acquirement of ordered fact. Freedom and discipline are the two essentials of education. Here's one. There can be no mental development without interest. Interest is the sine qua non for attention and apprehension. You may endeavor to excite interest by means of birch rods, or you may coax it by the excitement of pleasurable activity. But without interest, there won't be any progress. Oh, I tell you, there's so many good ones. I just feel awful skipping them. In the conditions of modern life, the rule is absolute. The race which does not value trained intelligence is doomed. Not all your heroism, not all your social charm, not all your wit, not all your victories on land or at sea can move back the finger of fate. Today we maintain ourselves. Tomorrow science would have moved forward one more step, and there will be no appeal from the judgment which will then be pronounced on the uneducated. Oh, I tell you. The first thing that a teacher has to do when he enters the classroom is to make his class glad to be there. Well, there's just lots of goodies. So Whitehead did say a lot of things directly about education. But unless you know this, you won't see exactly how these general ideas connect with that. And he didn't systematically make the derivation. That's more or less what we have done. And the main vehicle for doing that is the formation of theory, to which we now turn our attention in the last part of this section. Now, one objective that I have for this little half hour is to get going a love affair between you and theory. The only thing is that theory is not naturally seductive. I do wish it were, because it would make the love affair proceed at a much faster pace. In fact, to most people, theory is just downright ugly and repulsive. So I'm going to try to make it beautiful and attractive and seductive. Now, you have this little document, Theory into Practice. Did they all get it today, Mag?
Yes.
Yes. Now, I would like you to read this tonight. I'm going to make some comments now which draw on this, but which are elaborations of this. In the literature on the structure of scientific theories, there has emerged something of an important logical distinction between experimental laws and theories. And I think getting a hold of those distinctions will help you see the usefulness of theory. Ordinarily, laws, experimental laws, contain only terms which refer to observable phenomena. Now, these are general statements, so you're always going to be able to find some differences. And I'm afraid the terminology in the literature isn't a very useful or accurate guide to the distinction, because some people say law and they mean theory, and some people say theory and they mean law, and therefore you're going to have the law of such and the theory of such, and it's not going to fit this explanation. But I'm talking now about those people who spend their time thinking about these things and have organized these two approaches in this way, and it's useful for us. If the thing isn't observable directly, at least what you're talking about is operationally definable. In some reasonable way. For instance, if you took the statement, absence makes the heart grow fonder, and you want to do a little research on that, you would have to define being fond, or what fondness means, and what you would accept as evidence for getting fonder, and you would have to define heart. And I think if you defined heart as an organ next to the liver that beats, that's not what it means in this context, you see. But you might be able to operationally define fonder. You'd say, well, I will accept as evidence that before the absence, he made the two people who are being separated communicated. They communicated sweet nothings 10 times a week. And then you would say, my evidence for growing fonder would be that after the separation, there would be an increase in that rate of communication of sweet nothings. Isn't that what they do? They're whispering sweet nothings in each other's ears, or they would write epistles of sweet nothings. What? No. Okay. Theories contain at least some terms that do not refer to observables and which are not operationally definable. So these theories are trying to get at unobservables. Now, let me give you some examples in theories. Electron. So much of what we know about electromagnetic phenomena has been derived from the idea of the electron. Or take the idea of a photon. You know what a photon is? A photon is the smallest unit of light. And it has mass or weight when it's moving, but when it stops, it has no weight. Now, that's a little mind-boggling. And these little photons travel at 186,000 miles per second in straight lines, for all intents and purposes. So the light comes from the ceiling, and it showers these photons down all over the place, and they bounce back in every direction. But in whatever direction they go in a straight line. So that all of the ones that are bouncing in straight lines to my eyes, I have learned to project out in precisely that same straight line, and that keeps you looking like you are. If the lines were not, if the photons didn't travel in straight lines, you'd be all wavy and messy, and I could never get at you. And in fact, the truth of the matter is, my subjective experience of all of you takes place right back here. And I have just learned by experience to project you back out into the environment, because I came to have the experience of experiencing this thing inside my head, but then I come to touch it, and I can see my own hand, and I can wiggle it. And by that experience, I came to be able to project back out into the environment everything that's taking place right back here, because in the occipital lobe is where vision takes place. A photon hits my eye, and incidentally, the rods of the eye are sensitive to one photon. That's how magnificent they are. And it sets up a chemical reaction that sends an impulse back here, and it says something went on out there, and I project it back out. Without that theoretical perspective of photons, we wouldn't have lots of knowledge that we have about light. We wouldn't have laser beams and all kinds of things that we have now. Because if you get a strong beam of photons, if you focus a lot of light through a ruby, So it comes out in one definite stream and doesn't deviate from that stream. It is so powerful, it'll just cut right through the table. In fact, if you've ever been to a clothing factory, you'll see how they cut out suits now. They will put a stack of wool material this high, and they just cut the pattern of the coat out with a laser beam because it doesn't move the material. See, now, you know how difficult it is if you even have two pieces of material together and you try to cut two. The scissors causes one to shift this way and they're not the same size. Now they just cut out a stack of 100 suits with a laser beam, and that light just carbonizes a fine line, just cuts it right out and doesn't even move the cloth. And they're now using very fine laser beams to attach detached retinas. And the lens of the eye is so clear that it lets the laser beam pass through without cutting it. That's the amazing thing to me. You think it'd cut the lens, but it doesn't. And what it does is it sears part of the retina right to the back of the eyeball, just like a burn, and seals it. It's literally a form of biological welding. And it is so good that the person who has to be hauled in like this, because if you jiggle, you know, you have detached retina, it may become more detached and blindness results. You can get up right from the chair and go play tennis after your retina has been attached by this new welding system. I'm just telling you, we wouldn't have that if we didn't have a theory to tell us something about the unobservables. Now, of course, you could say, well, we can see light. Aha, it's true, we can see it, but we can't see what it is directly. Not enough to do much with it. But once we know what it is, we can do an awful lot with it. And part of Einstein's whole theory, you know, centered around the idea that light could be made to travel not in a straight line because it is subject to the gravitational pull of different bodies. In other words, if a star up here is shooting past the sun, a photon may come like that, and it will bend in slightly as it passes the sun. Now you know that much of the light from all the stars you see at night come from stars that are millions of light years away. Do you know how far a light year is? A light year is the distance that light will travel in a year at 186,000 miles per second. So you would take, for 1 year, 365 days times 24 hours times 60 minutes times 60 seconds times 182,000. And that will tell you how long a light year is. And most of the stars that you see at night, the light started several million light years ago. So that the light coming into your eye right now started on its journey so long ago that it may be that the star is not even there now. Now, if that doesn't blow your mind. And you see, the big occasion of testing Einstein's theory of relativity had to do with a time of a total eclipse of the sun, where they had observatories around the country set up. They had it organized so that they could measure to see whether or not the sun was pulling the light in, and it did. And so this had the effect of verifying what was, click over here, empirically verifying much of what Einstein was talking about, and that opened up understanding the nature of light and energy and mass and motion, and led us in the direction of understanding how energy is locked in an atom. And therefore we found that when we split the atom, we could get hold of that energy. See? Well, I hope you're convinced that theories have benefited mankind in enormous ways. Now, as is pointed out in this little document, one of the things you can't observe directly is the learning going on inside the child's head. And therefore, you must have a theory about it. And the more accurate this theory is, the better we will understand it. And the better we can understand it, the more effective we are in facilitating it. That's, in essence, what the 20 years of research on our drawing boards is all about. I think we have enough to make some advances right now without waiting for all of that testing. Well, I think you get the idea that laws are lower in the deductive hierarchy than theories. And once people generate hypotheses from theories, you know what a hypothesis is? Anybody?
Educated guess.
Pardon?
An educated guess.
Okay. And that guess is in the nature of an assumption or a thesis, which is the same word from which theory comes. And hypo means under, like a hypodermic, which means under the skin. Or hypothyroid is under functioning. A hypothesis, a hypothesis, is the thesis that supports theory. And if you generate lots of hypotheses from a theory, and you test them out, and they turn out to be supportable, then the theory gains credence. And eventually, as they pull together more and more empirical evidence for it, it suddenly degenerates, you might say, into a law. It becomes a law. But you see, it's a very specific kind of thing, and it only applies in a very circumscribed way, whereas the more general you become, the more theoretical you are. All right. Now, there's another important part about theories, which you have to keep in mind, otherwise you'll get demoralized in working with ANISA, and that is that theories are always organized in the context of the phrase, all other things being equal. In other words, theories are articulated as frames of understanding ideal cases, of which there are no examples. For instance, the idea of a frictionless machine. See, a lot of mechanics are organized around the ideal condition of a frictionless machine, but there's no such thing. But you see, once you got the ideal, then you can see how things work in perfect order. And now you know what to strive for, knowing that you can never get there. The only problem is, and you see people parents who start out going to raise the perfect child are setting themselves up for a nosedive, because that presupposes you are the perfect parent and that you're married to the perfect spouse and that you live in a perfect community with a perfect house and that you have a perfect income. Well, nobody ever does have any of those things. And the person who is out to marry the perfect spouse, the perfect mate, even if they find her or him, they're usually disappointed because that person is now hunting for the perfect mate too. Doesn't work. It never works out. In a very real sense, theory explains laws, and laws explain facts. That's another way that you can get the kind of relationship. Now, here's where the big rub comes. If these theories address unobservables, how do you make the connection with ultimate reality and that part of it that is observable? After all, we have to go on something. Usually, there is a set of terms which you might call rules of correspondence. And we usually see these rules of correspondence as part of the theory itself, or another way of saying it is that a model explicates the rules of correspondence that make the theory applicable. And our body of theory in the rules of correspondence we call the Anissa model. And we don't make all that much distinction between the theories and the rules of correspondence, but we do, in a sense, look at the model as the set of rules and ideas which link the theory to observables and make the practice possible. Definitions are a very important part of this. And tomorrow we're going to be getting into a lot of those. For instance, like defining what we mean by process in very clear terms, in a way that links it to something you can deal with in a child. Let me give you an example of a correspondence rule in physics. Many formulas in physics deal with what they call the mean kinetic energy of molecules. Now, a corresponding link would be a definition of that. And in physics, they define the mean kinetic energy of molecules in a fluid or in a gas as the absolute temperature of the gas. That gives them an operational definition of the mean kinetic energy. And every time they say that, you can translate it into something that's measurable, namely, get the temperature of the gas, and that will give you the mean kinetic energy of the molecules that make it up. Now, we try to do the same thing in Anissa. We say process this and process that, but at some point we have to say process is in such a way that you can be in touch with an observable behind which we are presuming is the ultimate reality you want to be in touch with. Now, the theories have to be refined over time because we don't know whether they're absolutely right or not. But we at least have the sense of their deductive clarity and consistency. And that's an awful lot to go on. If you've got that going for you, that's an awful lot. And thus far, I think we've been able to demonstrate exactly that this is the case, that you can react better to children and get to the ultimate reality if you see them in a certain way and if you do certain things with them in accordance with the theory. Now, I was going to do a little experiment, but I can do it tomorrow. I was going to get you to theorize about something that you can't see. And tomorrow I'll present a couple of problems to you, maybe just to start off, to get you to thinking like a theoretician, which is second cousin to thinking like a philosopher. It's all getting at ways of reviewing, of looking at things that you can't actually see. And for us, that means since we cannot open the kid's head and peek in there and see that learning taking place, we have to have theoretical knowledge about that. And if we then base our actions on that knowledge, we should be, if the theory is right at all, in better touch with the reality of that child, because that reality adheres in the process, and that process is carried forward by learning. Any questions? Any comments? Yes, George?
The problem here, in terms of the way in which I posed a problem for Dr. Bissell, who was asked by us to take a look at Anissa as to whether it fulfills the criteria of a scientific model, a theory. Her answer was yes. Let me clarify a question for myself, because I approached it in a slightly different way. My schema was you begin with observables. Your second step then is to build a theory, which are symbolic statements about how reality works, or that part of reality that you selected to observe. And it has three components of data, language, assumptions, and testable hypotheses. And then the third is to test it out. In building any theory, your unit of study, for example, if you're in physics, your unit of study can be thing-thing interaction.
Yes.
You can build a theory on that, design your own definitions, and move on from that. And that's a rather small component. They've been very successful in building theories along those lines. Psychologists have taken a unit of study of organism thing. What, I'm throwing a question at you, you might not have an answer. What is your unit of study in terms of the Anissa theory? How broad would you conceive of that?
Well, from a Whiteheadian point of view, the ultimate studyable thing is what he calls an actual entity. Anything that is in the process of being or becoming something. That could be a chair, it could be a worm, it could be a human being. But for the point of view of Anissa, it's a human being. And that means seeing that human being in all of its ontological aspects, which means how it is connected with everything around it, and how those connections, along with its own nature and the interaction between the two, guides the direction of its translation of potentiality into actuality. And you see, because it's an organismic model, it won't have quite the same causal connection, efficient causal connection between person, thing, or thing, which you find in older physical models of research and inquiry. Because there's that subjectivist principle which you have to get in touch with, which makes things a little more complicated.
The word, therefore, is comprehension.
That's right. That's right. Well, would if any of you any one of you has not been able to follow what I'm saying, I would appreciate very much if you would either come and tell me or raise your hand and tell me now. Because I don't want to go on like this now if what I'm saying isn't making sense to you. I know that is a repetition of a plea made earlier, but or if you don't say something, forever hold your peace. Yes.
Well, like you said, I thought I understood it as you said it. But to go back and reconstruct it, I'm not sure I can do that. And what I have is the illusion or memory of something that I understood, but I can't really pull it all together.
Well, that is an achievement in itself. No kidding. And I wasn't I mean, it would be a miracle if those of you who are hearing all this for the first time could leave here and have much more than a kind of sense about the body of thought on which the model is based, a sense of its scope, depth, coherence, and consistency. That's all I wanted you to get. And to stimulate you into reading some of the reprints and to maybe going back to reading some philosophy. Now, in the year ahead, because we'll be down here, there'll be a chance to hear these terms, try on these perspectives time and time again. And as Eileen and Harriet and some of those who've been around for a year or two, some of whom I recognize, will tell you that after a while, the perspective begins to take on some meaning because it connects with what you're doing. And every time you can interpret what you're doing in the context of this scheme of thought, it hooks everything up and makes it hang together much better. But I'll tell you what, it's an organic model. And there is one requirement of anything organic, and that is, it takes time to grow. There is no way you can get it at one fell swoop. Impossible. So, if you got what you said you got, then you get A+. You'll get more later, and then next time through, you have to get more. It wouldn't be A+, but for the first time around, it's good. Thank you all for coming. See you tomorrow. The questions that we were discussing yesterday, before we get into a discussion of the Anissa theory of development. In the Boston Herald American yesterday, there's a picture of a girl named Sarah Young who's depicted tossing a 50-pound bag of cement. And the question became, why would this young, attractive thing be hauling around cement for a living? And she indicates in the article that learning in college was unsatisfactory for her. And she makes precisely the point that we were discussing yesterday. She said she herself taught ceramics and made leather belts for a living too, since dropping out of the Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, because it was all intellectualism and no action. She is opposed to the great American dream success syndrome, in which money and reaching the top of the ladder are the goals instead of spiritual fulfillment and growth. So it's rather interesting that you see this time and time again in young people in universities particularly, who now just had it up to here with sitting in chairs and manipulating books and papers and concepts and never allowing those ideas to be expressed in action. We are better equipped in the younger ages to get kids acting because we have a way of setting up the environment to get them going. The challenge is to find ways of accomplishing that same kind of thought into action translation as you go on up to the higher levels. But our conviction is that ways have to be found to do it if we're going to have the most promising educational system for the future. It will turn out that some youngsters will find their lives dominated by cerebral activity, and that they're equipped to do it and they like it and they want it that way. And they will devote their lives to keeping their noses in books and manipulating thoughts and coming up with new knowledge. But that's going to be a small percentage, and even those people will need to, on occasion, see how their thoughts are being translated into action. This is just a little way of empirical verification of the thesis. We're over here in this empirical verifiability category. I just want to make sure that I have covered all of the questions that Mag posited on page 2 of the seminar sheet. The first question started out with, what is theory? Now, I'm just going to assume that we covered that, but I think that may be a reckless assumption, because I just get this feeling that if somebody met you on the street this morning with a microphone and said, what's a theory? That you'd say, oh my gosh, what is a theory? So I think I'll tell you again what it is, just in case. A theory is comprised of statements about the nature of things and how they are interrelated. And it usually includes the definitions of all the terms used. These statements almost always refer to things that you can't see directly. And that's where the problem with applying theories lie. if you had a chance to read the little Theory into Practice document, it discusses there what that chief problem is, namely that evidences for those phenomena and the way they are interrelated have to be inferred from something that is observable, and it is making that inference that is the sticky wicket. In other words, since you cannot see the learning going on inside the head, you must be able to infer it by something you can see in the way of what the child is doing, namely his behavior or some product of his behavior, like a paper. Well, a paper and pencil test is a product resulting from behavior from which you are willing to infer that the child knows something. This is why you don't like cheating, because cheating means he's got a little crib note here, and he's taking it right from the crib note right to the paper, just through his eyes. But he didn't actually have it in his head. That's why you don't like cheating, because it ruins the accuracy or the legitimacy of the inference that the learning is taking place. See? But we find the paper and pencil test as a product of behavior from which you can infer that learning is taking place is not the most satisfying kind of evidence that learning is taking place in all cases, because it deals largely with whether or not specific information has been stored and not whether or not particular processes have been internalized. Today we'll have a chance to get a sense of the difference there. After all, I think it's pretty easy for you to understand that if a child has a wrong answer on a complicated math problem, to just mark it wrong and hand it back to him isn't terribly useful. Furthermore, since you did not examine how he got the wrong answer, you are out of touch with the process, which is the essential aspect of the whole exercise, and therefore you can't even give him any feedback that's helpful, because you don't know where he went astray to get the wrong answer. Therefore, the examination of products and grading products and giving them back to children is not really the essential obligation of a teacher. It is more her obligation to examine the process and to give feedback on the process, because that's what will take out the error, you see. Well, number two, why is theory the best guide for practice? It's the best guide because it frees you from being tied to particular circumstances and instances. In other words, put you in charge of all the instances, all possibilities. If the theory is good, doesn't matter what happens, you'll be covered. If you don't know the theory, but you only know a particular instance, then you'll only be able to handle that instance. And when others come up, you won't know how to work with them. The example I like to use is that of a good chef, as opposed to a very ordinary cook that's bound by recipes. The very mediocre cook, maybe I should say, that's bound by recipes is somebody who is bound to recipes because they do not understand the theory of cooking. Whereas the master chef understands the theory of cooking. You put a master chef in a kitchen with some groceries. It doesn't matter what the groceries are, what utensils he has, what kind of stove he has. No matter what is there, he can apply the theory of cooking or meal preparation. In case he doesn't have a stove, he may not be able to cook. He will be able to put together the most nutritious, palatable meal possible under those circumstances. Now, if you put a person in such a circumstance and they do not understand the theory of cooking or meal preparation or food preparation, and they trot in their recipe book and they open it up, and they will see half of the things that the recipe calls for are not there. Now they say, well, I'm sorry, I can't prepare a meal. I don't have this, and I don't have that, and I don't. This stove was on the blink, and this, and that, and everything else. You see. Well, the ANISA model and its theories are designed to equip a person to teach no matter where she is, under whatever circumstances, and she could be stuck in the hills of the Andes Mountains in South America with children whose language she doesn't even speak, with no equipment whatever. And under those circumstances, she should be able to organize some experiences for those children that would get the maximum educational mileage out of that situation. And the only way she could do that is if she understood a theory of development, a theory of curriculum, and a theory of teaching, such that the theory would show her all of the possibilities in that limited, apparently, environment, and would enable her to find a way of relating to that child, even though she doesn't speak that child's language, and do the best job possible. That's why theory is the best guide to practice. It makes you generative and therefore free, as opposed to bound to a particular method or material. So the idea of ANISA is to free people from specific materials and let them understand how to use any materials, whatever they might be. Of course, some materials are better than others, and with a theory, you can decide which are better than others. Of course, the more materials you have, the more possibilities you have, and therefore the better off you are. But supposing you don't have them, supposing there's a budget cut, or supposing you're in a situation where you don't have those things, well, the theory is the best then for you, because it enables you to get the most out of the least all the way along the line. The next question is, how do theories get changed? While you're thinking of the answer, I'm going to have a sip of coffee. While I think of the answer, I'll have a sip of coffee. In any case, both of us will have a chance to think. What is the pressure for getting a theory to change in the first place?
Something doesn't work.
Right. Now, there's something about a theory that makes it predictive. It says, if these things are thus and so, and they are related in this and this and this way, it means that if you do thus and so, you should get this and that. Now, supposing you do this and thus and so, but you don't get this and that, then you have to say to yourself, either I didn't apply the theory properly, which is a real possibility, of course, or the theory is not right. So there's always pressure to change the theory, to improve it. There's no end of possibilities of improving a theory once it is applied in practice. But it will never get changed if you don't try to apply it. At least the chances are of it's getting changed are remote if you don't try to apply it, because there's where it will be found wanting, and that's where the pressure is to change it. The problem is, of course, in finding out whether or not the theory is no good, or whether the person who is applying it isn't applying it right. And that's why in ANISA, we have to be a little cautious about tossing things out, because it is hard to apply it. And that's why several people have to apply it, because what often happens is that if you give 5 people the same theory to apply, it works for some and not for others. Now you have to find out why it worked for some and not for others. And chances are you'll find that some applied it better than others, and some didn't even apply it right at all because they didn't understand in the first place. So before one jumps into the whole messy business of changing a theory, which has been 13 years in the making, you have to make sure that it was applied right under a variety of circumstances by various people under careful observation. Then you can be sure if all 5 people bomb out, and they have all, and you've interviewed them and you've observed them and it's not coming back the way you think it is, then it's probably time to have a peek at the theory and see if it needs modifying, you see. Now, the ANISA model has built into it, through its whole theory of evaluation, an institutionalized means of perpetually refining and updating the body of theory. Another thing we have built into the model is a way of determining which theoretical perspectives turn out to be more productive and important than others, because there's so much of it. You may be in a situation sometime where you want to give people as much as you can in the shortest time as you can, sort of like now, you might say, like this week. And it would be nice to know which is really important and powerful and which is less important and powerful. Well, it's going to take us a little while over time to find out that. But that's the organization of theoretical priorities, or priorities of theoretical perspectives. And that'll take us some time to sort out. Number 4 is, in a sense, been covered by the answer to number 2. What are the strengths of a theory-based educational system? Well, in a nutshell, it's maximally flexible. It has the possibility of being comprehensive because the theory is general. It will cover all cases. And once you have something that is both general and comprehensive on the one hand and flexible on the other, you've got an awful lot going for you. An educational system which is just based on a method of doing the same thing at the same time for the same children for the same amount of time is based on so many erroneous presuppositions about the nature of the child that the system is bound not to work. Now, in the course of our discussion today, I am going to every now and again point out one of, or two, or three, or four, as they come up, theoretical perspectives in the ANISA model, which are propositions about the nature of the child and the way he grows and develops. Propositions which are violated by traditional systems, generally speaking. Probably less so in Suffield and lots of other places, but I'm just talking about American education generally. And you will see, once you begin to see what those are, what the advantages of a theory-based educational system is. With a theory-based system, there is the possibility of changing the system because you know what to challenge when something isn't working. What do you challenge when things don't work now? You just challenge the administrators. So they just challenge you right back, and since they have the power, that's it. But you see, if you have a theory-based model, and the administrators and the public and the school board and the teachers are all interested in that theory, when something doesn't work, everybody challenges the theory. And they still have something to work on to improve it. Makes a great difference in the way a system carries its responsibilities forward if you have a theory-based system. The focus of conflict is in the realm of thought rather than among personalities then. That makes it so much pleasanter. On our own ANISA staff, for instance, whenever we have disagreements, it's not friction among personalities. It's because our definitions aren't quite right, or we have made intellectual presuppositions about the body of thought we're discussing, and some are appearing from another point of view. So that I don't think it's any secret from anybody that the team of ANISA people are the most unified group, I suspect, in the entire university. And we all love coming to work because we can hardly wait to see each other. So we are in that marvelous position of doing what we want to do most in life with the people we love the most and getting paid for it. I mean, that's just about the best you can ever get. So we are pretty sold on this idea of a theory-based system for many reasons, not the least of which is that one. The theory not only is the source of unity of people's efforts, but when something goes wrong, then the focal point of inquiry and discussion is the theory. Of course, the people have to be basically nice people to start with, otherwise, I mean, that always helps, yes. We haven't really attracted and retained any terribly neurotic, hostile, ugly, nasty, repressed, incompetent people to our staff. Now, that's another matter, you see. But I think any system ought to be careful not to hire anybody like that. unless you're organizing a system where your objective is to take somebody like that and transform them. I mean, as you'll see when we get into the theory of development, and I talk about personality transformation, rehabilitation of juvenile delinquents, and therapy for psychotics and neurotics, well, this system does apply to working with those kinds of people, but I wouldn't put them on the central staff. At least not right away. Not until the central staff is about 300 people, so that you can assimilate and accommodate one or two, you see. But if you get it out of balance, the system has had it.
Check every theory, though.
What's that?
It's a good way to check.
Yeah,
the
check.
theory.
Yeah, that's right.
That's true.
Well, the theory would guide one
Yes.
not to hire too many people like that in the first place. You see, after all, there are selection criteria, because our theory of administration specifies very clearly the central role of staffing and what that means. And it means matching personality, talents, abilities, skills, and value systems to tasks and jobs and responsibilities and obligations that have to be met by a given position in the structure. And if you make a mismatch there, you are building in a destructive element in the system as a whole. So staffing is very important, and the theory, our own theory of administration, spells that out very carefully. It says, how can we bridge the communication gap between theorists and practitioners? Well, that's what we're trying to do right now, of course. You will notice in the Constructive Triangle article, Nancy Rambush's article in the end, contains her observations, on the field implementation of ANISA in Hammond and Maine. And it's always kind of exciting to see how other people view what's going on and view your life and so on. But she talks there essentially about a central team that are primarily theorists working with practitioners, and therefore this surfaces the issue of bridging that communication gap. And how do you do it? One of the essential prerequisites is, and this is always hard to meet for us, but we've managed pretty well, I think, and that is that the theorists themselves must have some practical experience. Now, this is often what you don't get among professors in a university. Their experience is entirely in their heads, and they can give reams of advice about how to do things, but they've never done them themselves. Well, I never think that goes over very well. Sort of like a lead balloon, by and large. But most of us on the central staff at ANISA have been on the firing line for years and years. And I'm going to tell you about some of those things as we go through the theory of development. But we have worked with parents, we have been in the courts, in the detention homes, in the mental hospitals, in every variety and conceivable type of school. We've worked with state departments of education, Head Start organization, parent organizations, every conceivable sort of educational agency up and down the line and in and out and around, and political organizations and school boards and administrators and various professional organizations made up of educators with particular interests. And we have been right down there in the kitchen floor scrubbing. So we are not talking about things in a sacred realm of an ivory tower without knowing what we're talking about. In fact, if you put the central team of us together, I think our collective experience of being on the firing line represents a diversity of experience that would be hard to match in any team in the country. Because we've really been down there. So although we look relatively tidy and clean, you should see us in our work clothes. We've been through it. So that's one of the things that's important. And I'm willing to venture to say that when you hear me talk, you get a sense that that what I'm saying comes from more than just my head, but that in fact it connects with some experience which I've had repeatedly. And I think that's one way in which this communication gap has to be bridged. Secondly, the bridge comes in making the definitions in the theory function as a correspondence language between thought and observable things from which inferences can be made about those phenomena that the theory tries to address. In our case, it is making a correspondence language that will correspond to the behavior of the child so that you can get at the learning inside his head that you can't see. Now, there's one other important point here which I'd like to make, and that is that the communication between theorist and practitioner has to be a two-way street. It can't be just from the theorist to the practitioner. The practitioner has got to observe carefully as they apply the theory, make observations, record those observations, and give feedback. If that's not there, then there's trouble, but we've had plenty of feedback. When people get disenchanted and upset and they don't understand something, they've always been willing to say it. Now, they may not have said it as soon as they should have, but they always wind up saying it sooner or later. Just don't wait till Christmas. You should do it before Thanksgiving. Or, in other words, as soon as there is a lack of understanding or something coming up that isn't understood, and you'll never know what it is until you try it. So it's hard to sit here and think it up, hypothetically. But when you're out there on the firing line, you have a sense of whether it's working or not. And usually that would be a sense of one's own inadequacy initially to apply the theory, but over time it begins to come. But there needs to be feedback in that way. Number 6, how can a practitioner assist the theorist in refining his theories? Well, I more or less just answered that now. Largely it comes from giving feedback. Let me give you an example. During our first summer at UMass, the Suffield team and the Hamden team and Fall River team came to UMass for 6 weeks. We ran a little school and so on. And of course we talked a great deal about process. Well, almost at the end of the 6 weeks, somebody raised a question about process. And it became apparent that a large percentage of everybody who had attended the 6 weeks workshop misunderstood it. But we were proceeding on 80 miles an hour, on the assumption that everybody understood it. And the only way we could find out at that point was if somebody gave us feedback on it. Because it takes a little while to observe a teacher and to begin to find out by observation alone what it is she doesn't understand. It's much quicker if she just says. See? Of course, she may not know. She may think she understands what she doesn't. That's another problem. But over time, even that comes out, you see. And we go on in our own staff, maybe for 6 months. And then pretty soon at a staff meeting, somebody says, no. And somebody else says, well, yes. And then we realize that we ourselves have not agreed on a definition. And so then it gets hashed out and it's rephrased because, as we were talking about these English sentences the other day, they can be ambiguous. And you wouldn't necessarily know they're ambiguous until somebody interprets it in another way. and then it gets sorted out. 7, why is theory superior to textbook manuals when applied to practice? The problem with following a textbook manual is that it will not apply to every child equally. Therefore, if you just follow it, it will not individualize instruction. So if you use a manual and you apply it to all 40 kids in the class simultaneously, it's not going to work for probably 85% of them. So the question then becomes, well, what is the alternative? The alternative is being so in charge of the content of whatever it is you're trying to teach. That's the information, say it's social studies or zoology or botany, on the one hand, and so in charge of the theory dealing with process and development so that you can take whatever you want the child to learn and provide an experience that fits him, usually in small groups. We know you can't have one-on-one instruction all the time. But it's absolutely the case that if you take a manual and apply it to 40 kids or 30 kids or 25 kids in a classroom, and you give them the same kind of experience at the same time for the same amount of time, that you will not be individualizing instruction, and some kids will lose out. Now, you will see one of the consequences of individualizing instruction is increasing the variability of output. Most people think that if you equalize educational opportunity, everybody will come out the same. But that flies in the face of everything we know about the individuality of human beings. If you individualize instructions, people come out, from an ANISA point of view, they will all come out similar in the sense that they all will have become more competent learners, but they will all come out differently and more differently because you will have built programs that draw out their strengths. And the strength of Johnny will not be the strength of Susie, and therefore when you compare them at the end of their ANISA educational career, they're going to be more different than they would if they went through a traditional school where their potentialities were equally suppressed. Because if you look at two people whose potential has been equally suppressed, they look more or less the same. But if you build on strengths, the people have different strengths, then they begin to look more different. Now, there's a wonderful advantage in that children who are working with other children who are more different than they are provides richer stimulus. So everybody benefits by this system. Now, I don't want that statement to be misunderstood. We would not feel comfortable in ANISA if we say, well, Susie is so different from Johnny because Johnny's now reached puberty, he can't read at all. His strength wasn't reading, so we didn't build on it. His strength was making Indian headbands, and he's made 5,000 since he's been in the system. Well, you know, that's not what we're talking about. Because it's right to build on somebody's strong suit, but you have the obligation, if he has an undeveloped area, to provide experiences there which bring that up to the maximum level possible. So there is no, what I said should not be taken as the theoretical justification for neglecting a child because he has so many weaknesses, and then just let him do what he likes doing most, which might be dribbling a basketball and throwing baskets all day, you see.
Dan,
Yes.
would you address, see, from where I sit right now, I think that what you have just said is probably the most controversial statement about ANISA. I'm sure that the teachers sitting here are thinking, I'm one teacher with 30 children, how can I possibly draw out every single child? And this gets to be a very touchy thing, and I wish you'd ask the group if they would like you to talk further on that point, because...
Well, I'm going to talk more about it even if they don't like it, because because that's what this whole theory of development is about. And if you don't want me to talk about that, that ruins the day's agenda. So, but having you say that, Eileen, cues me to maybe tagging a number of statements as I go through today and show how it addresses the issue that you've raised from 20 different points of view. Is that okay?
Fine.
Okay.
Maybe it's not a problem with anyone else.
No, it is a
fine.
problem. It's a problem for us, too, because if we are willing to admit that equalizing educational opportunity could be regarded as America's #1 educational issue, then the question you raise about ANISA is precisely the set of theories, pertains to the set of theories which we claim will address that issue. So it is important. Now, before we go on to that theory of development, I just want to do a little demonstration here for fun. I want to propose a problem to you and have you theorize a bit about it. And although what I'm going to do is observable, it's going to be only observable in a strange, confusing sort of way, so that it's not as observable as you might think, because you have to create an image in your mind of what it is you're observing, which is a little more difficult than it might be otherwise. I'm going to create for you something that's confusing in the sense that I'm going to claim that it has only 2 dimensions, even though it will look like it has 3 dimensions to you. And then I'm going to pose a problem, and I want you to theorize for a minute and tell me an answer to a question on the basis of applying the theory. As you see, I'm making one big long strip of paper here. And I'm going to, you know what I'm making? Have you ever seen a Tobias strip before? How many of you have seen a Tobias strip? Okay. Can you define a Tobias strip? A what? Mobius strip. Yes, you're right, it is. I'll tell you why I said Tobias, because I was looking at Tobias, which last night in my philosophy book, which incidentally I brought you to show you in this new edition. Have you all seen this? It's Masterpieces of Word Philosophy in Summary Form. Now, if we just had had this 13 years ago, it would have been such a nice thing. But you may all want to grab a copy of that at some point. It's edited by Frank N. McGill, put out by Harper & Row. And it's wonderful because each section has a digest of a digest, followed by the digest. So that, for instance, under, say, here's Parmenides, the way of truth and the way of opinion. And it gives, in just this little place right here, the principal ideas advanced by that particular philosophical document. And then there is a discussion of that, which only lasts about 4 or 5 pages. And if you have read the original document, then that really is a wonderful summary. I am not sure that if you haven't read the original, whether or not you would get that much out of it or not. Anyway, for those of you who've seen this kind of a strip, you go ahead and theorize, but let the others do most of it out loud. Now you see, there is an edge here, and there is a surface here, and then you turn it over and there's another surface here and another edge here. Now we could reduce the number of dimensions of this object if we could make this edge the same as this edge, and this surface the same as this surface. And the way of doing that is to turn it like this, and then make a half turn. And when you do that, as you will see, what I should do is have scissors passed out, and you should all make one of your own. When you do that, this edge goes like this, comes under there and around, and now it's this side. So it never ends. So it's the same edge. So it only has one edge instead of two. Now the same is with this surface. You see, it goes like this, goes under, comes out on this side, and that surface is the same as this side. So it only has one surface and one edge. That reduces the number of dimensions, although it looks like they're different sides. They're really the same side because of this half twist. Now, since when you cut something in half, if I cut this piece of paper in half, the cut that I make creates two new edges. Is that not right? This edge and this edge. But if I cut down here, this edge would, you would think, be the same as this edge. My question is, and I want you to theorize, can I cut this strip in half and make two separate strips, given those particulars? Now you have 5 minutes to theorize. You can even draw a little diagram.
Can you cut it in half and make two separate strips?
Yes, if I cut this in half right down here, will it make two separate strips, two separate circles? She says yes. But on what theory? On what theory do you base that? Because I just pointed out that if this edge is the same as this edge, and if I cut down the middle, I will be making an edge parallel to this. I cannot make two edges. I can only make one edge.
But what you're doing is making a division of an object, so you're in fact separating it from itself in the middle, theoretically.
Ah, but that's the point. Theoretically, am I separating it in the middle from itself?
How do you
Well, it
separate a
doesn't-
single edge?
Why does it matter what the shape is?
Because I've reduced the number of dimensions.
It doesn't go back to the indestructibility of matter.
Well, in a strange sort of way, I guess you could say that.
You still have
But the
same-
point is, if I'm cutting here, and it turns out that that cut only makes one edge instead of two, then can I really cut it in half? You want to see what happens?
It's a semantic
Thing is,
problem.
no, it isn't. You cannot cut it in half and make two.
You're double your dimension because it's only enough for one strip.
That's right. It does get back to the conservation of matter, you might say, because
Okay.
I'm not going to reduce the amount of surface, but it will be distributed differently, but you cannot put it into two separate pieces by cutting it down the middle, as you will see. Now this goes.
Yeah, it's gonna be a line of
Now you just, for young children, this is so fascinating because they expect two circles to come out from it. But you couldn't put it into two separate ones. Now, what happens if I cut it again? Because now that cutting has destroyed its two-dimensional nature. If I cut it again, what happens? Theorists? Yes, I have a full twist now. That cut made a full twist, which means that cut restored the dimensions. So that this outer edge now is different from this edge. Now, if I cut it again, what? And how will these circles be related? I don't know. Your theory isn't very well developed yet, dear. Of course, the wonderful thing is that these questions are subject to empirical verification. That's why it's so nice. What? That's right. You're going to have them linked, but in a very interesting way.
Is there a difference between doing that with a pair of scissors and doing it with a pencil? What would happen if you did it with a pencil?
If you did it with a pencil, you would just go around and around and you'd meet yourself.
Well, then if you'd meet yourself, why wouldn't they be separated and be equal?
Because you shouldn't. But you meet yourself only after going around twice with a pencil, whereas if you're
Okay.
going to be in cut it in half, you'd have to meet yourself going around only once. The thing is, when you cut, you are cutting twice as fast because it's the same edge. I know that. You see, if you take a pencil, you have to go around this way, then you go on the inside and around. But when you cut, you're cutting twice as fast as you would ordinarily.
Okay, so it's
'Cause
on
you're-
the surface that does the pencil.
That's right.
And isn't it ultimately a semantics problem in terms of how we define edge and line and...
No, because if the edge were not the same edge, it would cut the first time into two separate circles.
Still
And the
must
reason
have to
that
do
you're
with the
cutting
way
twice
we
as fast is
define
you've got one blade on the underside and one blade on the top side.
But cutting must include this category of phenomenon somehow.
Like a cat's cradle.
Uh-huh, it is. It's woven.
Without Tasseville.
Oh, my time. I can see my epitaph. Here lies Dan Jordan, strangled by a Mobius strip. Now, would you believe what happens when you cut? No, I can't go in. I've cut them. I've started out with a Mobius strip this fat and cut about 8 times. Well, you could, theoretically, with your mind, predict, without doing it, a priori, exactly what happens without doing it. And then, of course, you can actually cut it and see what happens. Now, the point is, supposing you wanted to find out what the combination would be like with 800 cuts. Well, you can't make 800 cuts because it would be too thin. That's the advantage of deductive analysis once you have the premise. Because it can tell you absolutely with certainty how things will be, even without your ever having to do them. See, for instance, nobody has, that I know of, counted up to 500 billion trillion numbers. But we know that they're there, don't we? In fact, you know, the number of particles in the universe. Where's my chalk? Such a tiny piece. I think that's the projected number of particles in the universe. And that doesn't seem like very much, but nobody's ever counted that much. It's a huge number, but when you express it by powers, it just leaps up enormously. Yes, Dick?
But the reason I want to make this, there are theories and there are theories and there are theories.
That's right.
And some theories take care of this group of phenomenon, but exclude this because we're not that far along in terms of our discovery or our theoretical constructs.
That's right.
Now,
In other words, a theory, every theory has boundary conditions.
my point.
Some will be more general than others. The narrower the constraints of the theory, the fewer phenomena it can be applied to. And the fewer phenomena it will relate and illuminate.
Well, let me go back to your Mobius strip. We had a theory that if you cut something in half, you had 2 pieces.
If that thing is in 3 dimensions.
Beg your pardon?
If that thing is in 3 dimensions.
Okay, fine, you added on something to a condition, but that's okay. Then we found a phenomenon that violated that theory. Now we have to go to a new theory.
No, but part of the theory was, well, that's why I wanted you to create, I just wanted you to put forward an erroneous theory, which she did. I didn't pay you. I didn't meet you beforehand, did I? No.
Well, and I think this relates to Anissa, because Anissa says when we find the phenomenon, that violates our theory, we change our theory, we
That's
don't
right.
exclude the phenomenon.
That's right. It's the same point.
Which is a building up kind of theoretical base.
That's
which I
right.
think is
Which is what we've been doing for 13 years. But we have never had a chance to implement the model in partial form in a system itself. Now, I'm going to tell you this morning some of the experimental work we did in bits and pieces in different programs to illustrate cases in point. And ultimately, of course, our dream is to have a facility constructed on the basis of our own architectural specifications, which are derived from this theory of development we're going to go into shortly, and and start working with fathers and mothers before conception, because ANISA begins before conception, and the educational program for the child begins on day one. Now, we want to test that out in that way. You see, when we start here, the child is already 3 or 4 years old by the time it gets into the 2 preschools. And of course, there was no way we could lay the whole of the ANISA model on at once. There is no way you can assimilate all that. And ultimately, we see the possibility of establishing satellites to this central operation for the research and demonstration that's going on. Satellite schools who want to convert, say like Suffield, over a 12-year period, convert a year at a time, the entire system, which may be even going too fast. I'm not sure. It depends on how much money there would be available to keep people here working with teachers. Because you see, if you can only come down a few days at a time, it's hard to keep it going and moving. But as we move in the direction of creating a staff development agency that is a part of the school system, that is the liaison and link with the central organization going on, then I think you can keep things moving very much more quickly. And that will give us the opportunity to have the feedback that you were talking about, Dick, practically on a daily basis. You see, and you wouldn't jump, be all nervous and throw the theory out and change it if you had a few people unhappy with it. You would need, over a year's period, a repeated evidence of banging your head against a brick wall when you apply the theory. And then you could be pretty sure that the theory needs to be altered in some way. Now, the reason it's going to be difficult is because of the hierarchical nature of the theory. See, if you have sub-theory B down here and sub-theory A here and sub-theory C here, if you have two situations in which it looks like both theories might apply, and you apply the subordinate one when this one takes precedence because of a factor you haven't seen, then of course it's not going to work. And it will not be because the theory is wrong. It's because, well, take a look at law. See, when somebody commits an offense, and now you have to decide what to do, some laws take priority over other laws. And you have to find out, and if you got them out of order, then the way you handle the case will be different from if you have them in order. Same problem will be with us, but that's a little bit too complicated to go into now. Incidentally, you know, somebody has invented a bottle, which is the counterpart of this strip. I think it's called the Klein. Klein? Klein. Is it
I've
Klein?
never seen one, but every other science fiction story I've ever read, they mention it.
I actually saw one when I was at Oxford. I saw a Klein bottle. And it is a bottle in which that same phenomenon is expressed, namely that the outside is the same as the inside. So if I had one before you, I would ask you to theorize what happens when you pour water into it. It leaks. Yes, right. But it leaks in a very creative way. You wouldn't believe it. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, that most people would not ordinarily come upon such things. They are creations of a theoretical creature, man. Nobody is going to invent a Klein bottle. That comes about by ingenious thought and not by accident. Well, before we leave the realm of theory, let me make one last point, namely that we want our children to become theorists early. And the way to do that is to confront them with unknowns and have them speculate, because the word theory means to speculate, on how things work, even though they can't see them or that they're unknown to them. And you will find that the NISA body of theory contains solid theoretical justification for what might be called discovery learning. Now, of course, if you wait for every child to discover everything as a way of learning, he would really be slowed up. One of the advantages of being man is that people can tell you what a wheel is and they don't have to wait around for you to invent it. And we can't wait around to have children discover everything that there is to be discovered, because the likelihood of a child discovering how television works or discovering television or any of the great inventions of mankind is highly remote. And it would just take forever. So you can't use the discovery approach for everything, but it ought to be built in as a steady experience all the time. In other words, a week should not go by that the child is not asked to theorize about something. Now, this does a couple of things. It makes a speculator out of him, a theorist. And it makes an inquirer of him. It is a way of formalizing and perpetuating the phenomenon of curiosity, which is one of the chief internal motivators for learning. If your modality of teaching snuffs out curiosity, then you have an uphill task. If your modality of teaching fans it and keeps it nice and burning, then your experience as a teacher in that classroom with those children will be one of great enjoyment and enthusiasm and excitement. You will see how the whole model deals with the issue of unknowns. So when you approach a child with an unknown, and one way of doing this verbally is to show him something and then pose a question. That directs his attention to the fact that he doesn't know something. And when you ask him to come up with the answer, you are asking him to analyze the situation and propose a theory, if he doesn't actually know the facts. We need to be more careful about the way in which we deal with questioning so that children understand that what they are doing is theorizing and that they are formalizing a modality of inquiry that is going to be productive. And nothing is more exciting than a 5-year-old theorist, because their orientation to life is one of vitality and enthusiasm. Okay, now I want to go into an explanation of the theory of development. Add a few things that we haven't discussed before for those who are with us for the third year, and make sure I hit all the fundamentals for those who are here for the first time. As we indicated yesterday, The fundamental first principle from which everything else derives is this idea of translating potentiality into actuality. And it is the function of the theory of development to explain that. Everything else, all other ANISA theories, are derivative from this overarching theory of development. The theory of evaluation, all of them are connected with that theoretical, sort of a mother theory, you might call it. Let me just, That's what we reviewed yesterday. That's what we're going to do. This is what we're going to do Wednesday and Thursday. And these two things we will not be doing. I don't know why that's like that. Now I'd like to start off with a little discussion of creativity, because we are making synonymous the idea of the process of translating potentiality into actuality, making process synonymous with creativity. The child, then, in essence, is a self-creator. That's to say, he is a self-actualizer. I don't think that phrase is foreign to you. And the issue is whether or not you can train a child to be a competent self-actualizer. And if so, what would be the difference between an incompetent self-actualizer and a competent one? We think there are differences. One of them is that the competent self-actualizer is more in charge than the incompetent one, who is more a passive recipient of pressures to do this and to do that come from the outside. So that efficient causes play a greater role in the shaping of the personality in the case of the incompetent person, whereas final causes, purpose and intention, plays a larger role in the case of the person who's really more in charge of what he's going to become than the forces around him. Whitehead called creativity the universal of universals. It is the nature of change, of the basic changes in the universe that are building things up, creating new forms. The word creativity and the concept of creativity has got to be one of the most confusing ones in the literature pertaining to education. It's perhaps the literature on values and attitudes is more confused than this one. But this one is pretty complex and pretty confused. And I want to just review some of that thinking for you about creativity. It is a word which is so easily thrown around because we know how to use it in a sentence and how to pronounce it and spell it. But I've not met very many people who could sit down and say, this is my understanding of creativity, and then articulate an understanding that identifies absolute first principles. and ultimate ontological considerations. Here's the document on creativity, which is parallel to do it in the university for years and years. I mean, we did it by working right after we got home. Most of the work of ANISA in the early years was done by people after hours, from 12 to 3 a.m. and on weekends, until we got our first money, see? And so you have to have a certain kind of divine madness to put that kind of time in. That's why you will note that in the future, if schools do become patterned after ANISA, and it's going to take us some convincing of the public, teachers will be in contact with children for no more than 3 to 3.5 hours a day. The rest of the time will be spent in planning and thinking.
And when you talk about educational systems, now, is that going back to what you described? You don't call Bank Street a system.
No, I mean like Suffield.
Is the
Yeah, like the public schools, yes.
Okay.
In other words, I see no evidence in Suffield or anywhere else for that matter. This is no particular criticism of Suffield. It's just the way things are in American education. Namely, educators it is unappreciated that to provide good educational system requires thinking and studying and updating and planning and refining. And I know that many of the people who've been involved in ANISA found that during these last 2 years, the amount of time that they put into their profession went up enormously. I mean, there was just like the curve went like that. But that's only because we couldn't get them release time to do it during the day, which is when it should be done. See? You don't expect a surgeon to come into the hospital at 8:30 in the morning and just take out appendices until 5 and then go home. He'd collapse under the strain of it. Or he would become very sloppy, in which case he would start losing patience. Now, that's one of those ambiguous sentences again. He could lose patience and patience. Yes? Yes?
Under those circumstances that you're describing, do you foresee that there would be a groundswell from the bottom up or other way around?
Well, I think, yes, we try to get both going, and maybe they'll meet somewhere in the middle. Eventually, it's going to come when the efficacy of the model is demonstrated in its full bloom, and parents then insist that their children have it. Because if they insist, they're the taxpayers. And they'll say, look, let's take some of this tax money that's being put in over here. You may not want to increase the total amount of taxes, you may just want to distribute them differently. Because when you see where the money goes, there's an awful lot of nonsense being financed by money. Did you have a question? No. All right, let me talk a little bit now about creativity. I want to give you a little bit of a historical overview. And what you will notice as I proceed is that very few people who have worked with creativity have bothered to ask themselves fundamental ontological questions about it. And therefore, in reviewing that literature, we never found much directly useful to us in terms of a fundamental approach to creativity. But we're glad we did it because it let us know where everybody else is coming from and lets us know how everybody uses the word. People say, well, we should have a creative school. we shouldn't suppress the creativity of the child. And by that they usually mean they should let him run free. But they've never discussed the difference between creativity, freedom, structure, discipline. And one of the things we're pretty certain about now is that structure and discipline, dynamically conceived, are prerequisites to creativity, no matter how you're talking about it. Because creativity always means bringing into being a new order. And order itself means having boundaries, having structure, having form, and therefore cannot be chaos, which is what most people think, or there is that flavor about most people's view of freedom. Okay, I want to give you just a little quick overview. Research in creativity got underway about 25 years ago, in the 1950s. The names of Taylor, Giselin, Smith, Getzels, Jackson, Barron, Golan, Guilford, Torrance, Kogan, Wallach, Mednick, Cattell, McKinnon, and Maltzman are the names of the people who've done the research that I'm going to give you an overview of. Two in particular, and one especially, Guilford. Guilford wrote a book called The Structure of the Intellect, which was a new approach to looking at IQ. The work on creativity really got underway when Guilford put out that book, The Structure of the Intellect. That work raised a number of major issues. One, what is creativity? Two, how is it different from intelligence as measured by IQ tests? Three, how can creativity be measured? Four, how can it be fostered? And five, where should we put the focus of our attention to understand it? I was very sensitive to the idea that IQ tests did not measure creativity. Because I remember when I took my first IQ test, I think I didn't do very well on the math part. I never got to see it, of course, back. But I just have that recollection that when I came to the math part of it, I didn't do as well as I would have liked to have done. But I also knew that I could play a Beethoven sonata from memory on the piano, and that you have to have some intelligence to do that. And there was nothing in the test that enabled me or gave me the opportunity to express that. And I knew that some of those guys who might have done pretty well on the math wouldn't be able to play a Beethoven sonata. They didn't even know what a sonata is. They'd never heard of Beethoven. And that I could even compose some music. And that takes some doing, intelligence, and understanding, and knowledge, applying rules of harmony and so on. I could also draw pretty well. I had a lot of paintings. In fact, when I was 13, I had an art exhibit at the Carnegie Art Gallery in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. All those paintings were sold or given away, but I still have a few things. But still, that IQ test didn't ask anybody to draw or paint anything. So it was pretty clear to me that IQ tests were slanted away from creative, artistic operations. And so a lot of this research that started in the 50s began the inquiry into creativity by trying to see how and in what way it differed from intelligence. So let me just give you a few perspectives on each one of those questions that I just read to you. Guilford tried to find a way of looking at intelligence that would account for creativity or isolate it in some way. And at the same time, he put himself in a straitjacket because he came to look at intelligence and creativity almost entirely in terms of cognition, which is just one way of being creative from an Anissa point of view, namely through thinking. So you're going to see that this has a rather narrow look. He tried to establish a difference between two basic kinds of thinking, convergent and divergent. Most tests in school and all IQ tests and most instruction in school is geared to making the child a convergent thinker. For instance, when you ask a child, what is the capital of Connecticut? That does not require speculation. There is one answer and one answer only, and that's Hartford. And if they don't say Hartford, Hartford is the capital of Connecticut, isn't it? I had to memorize him at one time, but I thought it was a waste of time then, just as I do now, so I'm not sure I remember. If he puts New Haven, then it's wrong. Convergent type tests are so easy to give and so easy to grade, and that's why we love them. But it's also why children hate them. Divergent thinking, instead of starting from out here and coming down to a single point, may start at a single point and go out. And these kinds of tests are difficult to evaluate because you see, when you have 20 kids and you start from one point and you scatter them out in their thinking, how are you going to evaluate these? Here it's so simple. Hartford's it, bang, that's it. So we, in a sense, reward convergent thinking and punish divergent thinking. An essay-type test would be far more divergent than, say, the multiple choice true-false kind of tests. And the reason we don't like essay tests, even though they're far better by and large, because they not only require the child to be divergent, they require him to come to a conclusion, which is a form of convergence at the end, so you get both, is that it takes too long to read them, and they are too difficult to evaluate. Because here you got two essays, entirely different, coming to different conclusions, using different information. How will you compare them? Well, part of our problem there is that we insist on comparing them. Because we grade people not in terms of what they do, but in terms of what other people do. That's why we think that's an erroneous kind of giving of feedback. Because if you give Johnny a D, it means he got the D because other people got more of these convergent answers right than he did, and therefore you are evaluating him in terms of what other people did. And unfortunately, he has no control over that. We find it more important to give children feedback in such a way that they feel like what they can do then is to have that they will have control over the consequences. I remember attending some Head Start evaluation sessions, and one lady got up and said, "We have worked for 4 years to bring these children up." And she says, "I'm sure we have made some headway, but it's just awful." She said, 50% are still below average. Well, you see, as long as you're grading on the curve, average means at the 50% level. So no matter how intelligent your class is, 50% will always be below average of that class. So it's not a very good way of measuring, because you can never make any headway that way. See? That's why things are shifting now to criterion referenced testing. And we are going to have a very strong part of that in ANISA ultimately. So children will, in part, be working towards an absolute standard, which doesn't shift. See, a group of students can get together and say, let's none of us study. It'll bring the curve way down. See, and with less studying, if we all agree not to study, the brighter ones will still get A's and the mediocre ones will still get C's, but we don't have to do any work. See? But with an absolute criterion, kids can know what they're working toward, and everybody will be measured in terms of how close he comes to it, and not how well somebody else does. That makes a little bit more sense, at least for one way of giving feedback to children. You know, at Oxford, where I went for 3 years, they give you, when you arrive, the examination statutes, which is an outline of the material that will have to be covered in your final exam, which lasts 33 hours. And at Oxford, you go for 3 years without any exams. And then you have them all at once, with 33 hours of written exams, and you get your degree or you don't get your degree on the basis of that. Now, in order to arrive at the exam and be competent, you have to rehearse what you are learning every week. And it gets more cumbersome to manage it all. See, in America, you're given an exam at the end of every course. And people sort of cram the night before the course, before the exam. And then they walk into the exam like this, hoping they don't stub their toe or sneeze, lest it all be shaken loose. You see? And so they get in there and they write it out in a hurry, and then they get up and they just forget it all. You see, it's all gone. It was only sort of put in short-term storage for as long as the exam. The Oxford system, there is no cramming. If you think you're going to cram 3 years into something 2 days before the exam, it can't be done. But it's even worse, because after that 33 hours, you have what they call a viva voce exam, a live voice exam. And you come into a room all by yourself in front of 5 examiners, and they have everything you've written in the 33 hours out on a big table with little paper clips and red slips of paper. And then you have the opportunity to justify why you wrote that ridiculous paragraph on such and such. Because they open it up and they said, in this question you said, quote, and then they read this embarrassingly stupid observation that you recorded. And then you have a chance to say, well, I meant such and such. And then in which case they say, well, why didn't you say that? Well, what this does, knowing that you have the viva voce examination, keeps you from writing nonsense in the first place. And you also know that padding is verboten. Now, that you may think suppresses creativity.
One form of it.
One form of it, anyway. I remember a friend of mine telling me about in medical school, a kid had skipped class, and here there's going to be an exam. And so he said, what's the exam going to be on? And they said, it's going to be on the liver. So just before the exam, he studied up on the liver, and when he got in, he found it was on the stomach. So it says, define the stomach and, what is the stomach and all its parts. The guy starts out and he said, the stomach is a very important organ in the body. Now, right next to it is the liver. The liver is, and he goes on for 36 pages on the liver, you see. Well, that kind of creativity is the kind that probably isn't acceptable. Well, if you become too divergent on some of these exams, it probably isn't legitimate. Now, Guilford tried to get an idea of what divergent thinking was and to be able to define it fairly clearly, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about that. First of all, he felt that word fluency was a part of divergent thinking and therefore creativity. And there are ways that you can increase the word fluency of children and therefore make them better divergent thinkers. I don't think we have any trouble getting people to be convergent thinkers. It's usually the other way around, and there are some kids who are a little bit scattered in their thinking, and it is hard to get them to be convergent. But I think by and large in our public schools, the problem is the other way around. Word fluency means the ability to generate words fitting various structural requirements, like name 5 words that begin with T. So you have to do it right in a hurry. Kids who are fluent with words would be able to give you 5 words that begin with student. Or you might say, I want you to give me a string of 5 words in which each subsequent word begins with the same letter that the preceding word ends with. So you have take, even, night, tag, good, and dog. Now, a child who has no word fluency will simply be stymied by that. He just can't get it together, you see. Then another kind of divergent thinking is associational fluency, which is to generate words that have very similar meanings. In other words, just being able to rattle off synonyms. Another kind is what he calls ideational fluency, which is the ability to generate ideas that fulfill particular requirements, such as naming several uses for a potato. Well, you can eat it. You can make a stamp out of it. You can put it in the window and have a beautiful vine grow from it. You can squeeze the starch out of it and iron your shirt with it. What? Vodka. You can make vodka out of it. Do they make vodka out of potatoes? I didn't know that. Well, just shows I haven't had too much potato experience. In fact, I was born and raised in Nebraska, which is good potato country, you know. I wonder if that could be an industry for Nebraska to bring them out of the economic slump. They raise all those wonderful potatoes. Well, children without ideational fluency simply can't see the possibilities in an object, and therefore they will give you a very conventional, stereotyped sort of answer. Then there is what he calls expressional fluency, which means to put rapidly into juxtaposition words that meet certain requirements of sentence structure, like writing alternative sentences of 4 words in which the first letters of 4 words are given. For instance, supposing you take the word idea. You say to the child, quickly make a sentence in which each word in the sentence in that order begins with these words. Yes?
I don't want to disturb the trend of what you're doing, but I'm not quite sure. Are you saying divergent thinking and creativity are synonymous, or are these just parts of divergent thinking?
These are parts of divergent thinking, and Guilford's thesis is that divergent thinking is creative and convergent thinking is simply learning by rote
Right, I
of
got
the
that,
answers.
but is divergent thinking and creativity synonymous for him?
For him,
Or is divergent
as
thinking
far as
part
thinking.
of?
For Guilford, this is how he has come to define creativity.
So-
But as I said, he limits it only to thinking, and it's largely centering around words or ideas, but then, you know, it's hard to have an idea if you don't have a word to go with it. So I'm sorry if I didn't make that quite clear. All I want you to do here is to get a view of what American researchers in creativity over the last 25 years have thought about creativity, so that you can contrast it with a much deeper ontological meaning of creativity as it comes from the Anissa model, and show how the Anissa model accommodates their concerns while at the same time having a much deeper meaning. For instance, if you said, I don't envy anyone, that would be simple way of very quickly putting a sentence to those letters. Well, I'm not going to give them all to you. Let me just rattle them off. Another part of it has to do with spontaneous flexibility. That means you can just flip and toss out ideas, ranging from igloos to owls to alligators to the galaxies. Just go from one to the other without. It's the ability to make a leap among diverse things without having to go through a chain of related things. Adaptive flexibility means using a wide variety of ideas to meet particular requirements. Matchstick puzzles would be an example of that. Now, he also includes originality as one dimension of creativity, and this means making statistically unique responses. And I suspect that definition of creativity is the one people most commonly have in the back of their minds when they talk about it. If you have 40 children in a class and you say, "Children, I want you all to write a poem," 39 of them will write poems in the format of roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. But you'll have one child, say, who writes a haiku, and you'll say, "He's my creative one." In fact, in spite of the fact that all the other children created their poems too, you will say, "This is my creative one," because it was a statistically unique response. Now, of course, if all of the children had had lots of haiku experience, 39 of them might have written haiku, and only one written roses are red, in which case you'd say, "This is my creative child." In other words, the criterion for creativity depends upon it being statistically unique. And our theory accounts for how you get statistically unique responses. And if I forget to tell you how it does, then you remind me. Now, Jackson and Getzels did a number of studies at the time I was at the University of Chicago, and they published a book called Creativity and Intelligence. And generally speaking, all of these studies show that the terribly high IQ person is not the creative person. That's because the IQ tests require convergent answers. See? So that, on the other hand, they found out that the creative child that was measured by all these other kinds of things I've just been talking about, ideational fluency and so on, that those children never have low IQs. In other words, intelligence is a necessary but not sufficient condition for creativity. Our question, of course, is one that Guilford himself posed. What should be done to foster creativity, no matter how you define it? And we have some answers for that, too. They found that intelligence tests always correlate very well with any test concerning convergent type thinking, and that's where you get the high correlation then between the high IQ person and convergent thinking, and that's why you don't get the correlation between the high IQ person and creativity. One of the tests that Mednick used, which I think you might find interesting, has to do with a RAT test, R-A-T, which stands for Remote Associates Test. And I think maybe I suddenly have a deja vu looking at Harriet, that I have a sense that I've told you about this RAT test before, but let me just, for those who weren't here, let me just give you an example. if you put 3 disparate words together, like blue, cottage, and rat, what word would associate those 3?
Seashore.
Seashore, all right, for some, might be. Rats in the seashore, blue seashore, cottage in the seashore.
Is it fair if you remember?
What?
Is it fair if you remember from before?
You know, sure, yes.
Cheese.
Cheese, that's right, I did say it before. In other words, rats eat cheese, there's blue cheese, there's cottage cheese. Well, they found that the creative child, because he could just scout around, she has a very good memory, this gal, can find out the remote associate that would link those disparate things, you see. All right, one last point, and then I'm going to move on. And that is that after all of the research was done, they found that the thing that really made the statistically unique response was the person's capacity to deploy his attention to the periphery. Well, that's kind of divergent. In other words, he puts his attention out here rather than keeping it right here. You would never think of cheese as the remote associate for those 3 words unless you could just let your mind scatter around. Certain organizations like Synectics Incorporated, have you ever heard of Synectics? It's a firm that provides consultants to businesses to do some creative brainstorming to find some new answers to problems. And in the early days of the School of Education, we actually hired some people to come and be with us when we were trying to put together the School of Education at UMass. They came out to Colorado with us when we went on our little retreat to try to put the School of Education together. And their technique was essentially an exercise in deploying the attention to the periphery through what they called analogical excursions. So the problem would be defined, and you would begin to free associate from any word on the basis of that problem until you would get way, way out here somewhere. And then from there, you would begin a process of what they call force fitting to see how anything about whatever it was out there would fit into the problem in some way, shape, or form. In this way, having deployed your attention to the periphery, you're going to come in contact with 10,000 possibilities that you never would have thought of, and probably 99% of them won't be any good as you address this problem. Another way of summarizing this is to say that researchers in creativity have fallen into 3 camps. One camp looks at the product all the time. And these are the people who like the statistically unique response in the form of a product. A different kind of vase, a different kind of painting, a different kind of rug, whatever. Then there are those who look at the personality and try to find out creativity by looking at people that they regard to be creative. And there are some personality variables that seem to be associated with creativity. One is a higher than normal level of anxiety. In other words, if you're too calm and complacent, too bovine, you won't be creative. Bovine means cow, yes? We just have not met too many anxious cows. Otherwise, it would sour the milk, I feel sure. Secondly, the person is good at fantasy and daydreaming. This is the creative person now, not necessarily the productive person. You can have a lot of creative people are not very productive. They spend too much time daydreaming. But it's a prerequisite, you see. The point is how to stop the daydreaming and roll up your sleeves now and turn that dream into something. That's the hard part. They have a toleration of ambiguity and disorder. That doesn't, however, if you don't create order at some point, then the creativity never is expressed. It just hangs in there as a potentiality, you might say. And they like new things themselves. In the case of children, they're attracted to strangers. This is always a little nerve-wracking for these days, to have a creative child who likes. The last part is people who look at the process. And that's where we fall, as you will see. A couple of statements now about misconception concerning creativity, no matter how you look at it from any of these perspectives. One myth or misconception is that repetition destroys it. Actually, the evidence is that before you can be really creative in any area, you must have overlearned it. In other words, you could not be a good improviser on the piano if you hadn't overlearned everything there was to know about it. Now, the problem, of course, is if you insist on repetition when the child doesn't want it, then you may stifle things. But the fact is, nobody is going to be really creative unless he has overlearned whatever area it is he's going to be creative in. And you will find that children who are most creative in whatever area, they spend a lot of time going over and over and over and over and over whatever it is. If you get somebody, for instance, who suddenly is taken up with the guitar, well, he himself will just go over and over and over and over it. See, that's different from having the mother say, aren't you going to practice your guitar? You haven't touched it for 5 days. And so in a reluctant way, he drags out the guitar and plinks around a few times. But he'll only go through each piece once. And he can't stand the repetition. Well, chances are he's not going to become very creative on that instrument. Second misconception has to do with structure. People think it's bad for creativity. I think there's a lot of misconception about open education on this score. There are those people who think open education means creative education, which means no structure. Well, they're talking about chaos, and chaos is an enemy of creativity. Although differentiation, as you will see momentarily, is a prerequisite to creativity, and that means breaking things down into parts. And temporarily, they may look a little disordered until you get them back together again. And it's the ability to tolerate the differentiated state, which is a state of ambiguity, that is important in creativity, because if you insist on getting it back together too soon, chances are you'll put it back together the way it was when you took it apart, and you won't have anything new, which means you won't be creative in terms of the product. Third misconception is that discipline is bad for creativity. There's this thought that complete freedom is required, which means that if the child wants to throw a brick through the window, let him, otherwise you'll be suppressing his creative impulses. Well, discipline is necessary, as any artist will tell you. And if you don't have the discipline down, then you are not able to express what you have in mind the way you would like to, because you lack the discipline to have achieved it. Then there is another misconception that the creative personality is necessarily neurotic. Well, some creative personalities may be neurotic, but it's not a requirement. In fact, the large, overwhelming number of people find their creativity impaired because of their neuroses and not having their creativity inspired by their neuroses. Now, it's true that sometimes any problem that you may have as a human being, your response to that problem, which provides tension and anxiety, may be a stimulant to finding an alternative way of doing things, in which case it forces you to be creative. That's why tests and problems and obstacles are not in themselves necessarily bad things. It depends on how you relate to them. And you'll see in our developmental theory, we get into it right after the coffee break, that we have a way of seeing obstacles, tests, and difficulties and problems in the context of the theory, such that they can be dealt with in ways that actually foster the actualization of more potentiality and therefore, in that sense, creativity. Now, given that as a kind of a general background of the research in creativity, let me just close this little session by affirming our own position on creativity as ultimately, in the most basic ontological way possible, define it as the translation of potentiality into actuality. That means for a child who has never before written a roses or are red, violets are blue poem, that the first time he does it, it is creative for him. And that's what the teacher needs to keep in mind. The kid who writes the haiku may have written 20 million of them before, and therefore it wasn't so creative for him as it was for the child who wrote the roses are red poem. It's just that if you look at creativity in this category as a category of unique statistical responses, then you will say the haiku kid is the creative one and the roses are red kid isn't. But in actual fact, it may be that the roses are red kid is being more creative on that moment because he has never done it before, you see. Well, when we come back from the coffee break, we will explore in great detail then a discussion of the nature of potentiality, the nature of actuality, and what are the conditions for its translation. And that will be an outline of the UNISA theory of development. And I have some new information to impart to you of 1974 studies on development that you haven't had before, too. So we'll all have some coffee. Yes? You mean I've gone for 2 days and not said? He's asking the question, what does UNISA stand for? Well, I think it is explained in some of the documents, but let me give it to you again. It comes from an ancient word with both Latin and Greek roots, which refers, in a very technical sense, to an umbelliferous plant that sheds a fragrance all around. Umbelliferous meaning comes from the same word as umbrella, so it means a plant that provides shelter and shade. It's been used, the word, to represent an ancient symbol, the tree of life. We wanted some symbolic representation as a name for our effort, which would reflect aesthetically many of the qualities that convey the philosophical orientation of the model, namely perpetual fruition, growth, shelter, shade, grace, beauty, nurture, fostering, never-ending cycles of growth, so on. We debated a long time about this, as a matter of fact, or perhaps I should say I did, because there is some danger in giving a label to something, because people who are upset with it and don't know what they're upset with have a name to attack without having the idea, without even knowing what the ideas are. That's the problem with giving it a name. See, if we had said, well, this is the UMass Learning and Competence Model, nobody would know what to attack when they're upset. But the minute you say UNISA, you have a target. So we thought a long time about that. On the other hand, if you don't have a name to refer to the whole effort, it becomes tedious to talk about it all the time if you don't have a name for it. And we came to believe that this effort did beg for a name. But on the other hand, we didn't want to call it the Jordan model because there's also a bigger problem in naming something after a personality, especially when lots of people are involved in it. So we didn't want that, because after we're dead and buried and gone, we hope that the ideas will last and other people will carry them forward. So we gave it this name. And as you see, our little logogram, which was designed by a professional logo designer, Nancy Sears, reflects that idea of the tree of life. There are birds and flowers and blossoms and so on. Then we did another thing, which made us completely American. So we organized an incorporated not-for-profit organization called American National Institutes for Social Advancement, which was designed to organize a group of people who would find us the millions of dollars we needed to kind of make an end run around the establishment and do our thing. Well, I didn't make an end run around anything, as it turns out. The problem with something like this is it takes money to make it work before it can get more money. And so we sort of took the money out of our hides to get the corporation started. And it did attract some money, as a matter of fact. And in the future it may also. But the one reason I went that route to get that started is that somebody came to me one day about 6 or 7 years ago and said, I'd like to help Anissa in some way, but I don't have any money, but I've inherited some property and I'd like to give it to you. Well, I didn't want them to give it to me personally because then I have to pay taxes on it. I wanted to go directly to an incorporated not-for-profit organization that could receive it and who could then disperse the monies to help us do what we needed to do. And when somebody else came and said they had some property that they would like to donate to Anissa, then I realized I had to have such an agency, and that's why we incorporated it. And it is that corporation that holds the trademark of the symbol and under which all the materials are copyrighted. So it was useful from that point of view too. So I was attracted to the name, and I had made a rather detailed study of Fraser's 15-tome inquiry into mythology and symbolism. You know that enormous work called The Golden Bough of, is it Sir William or Sir Robert Fraser? He's an English anthropologist and literary figure who looked into the symbolic import of the major legends and symbols and mythology of mankind. And you see very frequently the idea of the tree of life, and the Golden Bough, which is the name of the whole series, in a sense expresses that idea of this tree. Another word for it, you know, arbor vitae or vitae, depending on how you learned your Latin. And you see there are some actual plants called this too, which don't look very much like trees. But this is tree, of course, arbor, and this is life, and it has the genitive case, which means of, so it's the tree of life. Now, the big problem is, how does that tree get from an acorn or from the seed into the tree? And that's what the theory of development is really all about. I don't know whether I can assume that you have had a chance to read the pamphlet on being and becoming the Anissa theory of development, but that reprint is available for those who would like to have it. It's a very meaty document, but it spells out many of the basic notions. of the model as they pertain to the actualization of potentiality, which is what we're going to discuss now. We have already established in the philosophical basis that potentialities of man are limitless. That is to say, we have no scientific means of imposing limitations on the conception of the possibilities for man. If you take the position that the potentialities are infinite, it means you cannot list them, because the list would be endless. The next best step, then, is to classify them, because you can have a finite number of classes into which fall an infinite number of things. So our first job, or one of our first jobs, was not only to define potentiality, but to classify them, thereby getting more and more of a handle on the phenomena we are trying to deal with. Let me first define in a general way what we mean by potentiality, and then classify them according to the theory, and ultimately show you how all of this relates to curriculum and teaching, which will be covered in subsequent presentations. The word potential comes from a Latin root word which means to be. I just read in here the other day, I think it was in here, one of these philosophers said, being ultimately means power. Identity means ultimately power. Power means energy. So for us, a potentiality is a patterned use of energy, or a patterned expression of energy. Now, of course, you want me to define energy, which I'm not going to do now, but yesterday we talked about the relationship between energy and mass. It is potential in that it is not yet in evidence, that patterned expression of energy. So it exists as a possibility. When it is actualized, any potentiality, it is in evidence as a patterned expression of energy in some way, shape, or form. That's as general and abstract as you can get. And yet, as you will see, we can identify behavioral reference that are observable, from which can be inferred the existence of given potentialities. Now, having said that, let me now classify these potentialities so we begin to get a better handle on them. We established two categories of potentiality. A, biological, and B, psychological. Biological means the actual stuff out of which the tissues of the physical body are made. The theory fixes nutrition as the key element in the actualization of biological potentialities. And it fixes learning as the key factor in the actualization of psychological potentialities. So of course now the theory has the obligation of showing how nutrition is the key factor and how learning is the key factor. We further divide the psychological potentialities into 5 basic categories. Psychomotor, perceptual, cognitive, affective, and volitional. In other words, we say there are 5 ways a man can use his psychological energy. Psychomotor, perceptual, cognitive, affective, and volitional, they're all interconnected. These are not, unfortunately, mutually exclusive categories, but we have conceptual justifications for making distinctions among them in order to give us a clear handle, a clear idea of what it is we're dealing with. Now, I want to talk for a moment about this. I don't think Patabi's coming down this summer, is he, Mag? No. No, okay. So I won't be stealing any of Patabi's thunder if I tell you a few things about this. Dr. Patabi Raman is the biochemist on our staff. He has a PhD in chemistry, organic chemistry, and also has a doctorate in education, so he's pulled the 2 fields together. Our basic thesis is that the biological organism must be characterized by the highest levels of integrity before the psychological potentialities can be actualized. And that nutrition is the key factor in ensuring the highest levels of biological integrity. It's not the only factor, it's just the key factor. For instance, you have to have air. You have to have shelter. You have to have the right temperature. You need exercise. There are lots of things. And these 2 categories are obviously interrelated. But if this is out of shape, this is going to be out of shape. And we now know from the study of psychosomatic medicine that if this gets too much out of shape, it can make this out of shape. For instance, as I was indicating yesterday, about 85% of the asthma cases that we treat in mental hospitals or in hospitals are psychosomatic in origin. If you get too worried because the mind is not handling problems, it will cause the stomach to produce acids at times when there is little food in the stomach, and those acids then begin to digest the stomach and create holes in the stomach or sores called ulcers. If you are nervous and tense because your emotions are not organized properly, that tension is expressed by squeezing the walls of the arteries and the veins such that the pressure in the blood pressure is high. The problem with high blood pressure is that it increases the probability of hemorrhage. And if you have a hemorrhage, then of course you begin to destroy the integrity of the organism because blood is flowing in places where it shouldn't. And also, it's a heavy strain on the heart. And therefore, you're liable to cardiac failure, cardiac arrest, or a stroke by having a hemorrhage of a blood vessel in the cortex, say. So we know that this also has an effect on that. But for now, I want to talk about nutrition and the maintenance of biological integrity as a prerequisite for this. And once you get this, then it has retroactive effects on that. When the sperm and the egg come together, the first cell is formed. and cell division begins. So the one cell becomes 2. Each of those 2 becomes a new cell, so you have 4, then you have 8, then you have 32, 64, 128, and so on. Initially, the cells become smaller as they get more, but not for long. Pretty soon the cells increase in size, and when they divide, they become bigger. That means they have to have more material. Where do they get the material? They get it from the food the mother ate. The mother eats food, the food is digested, it is carried by the mother's blood down to a part of the womb called the placenta, and those nutrients are given up to the placenta gathers them and takes them down the umbilical cord to the baby. This is the baby. Well, I'll make him a little more attractive. He looks like a thalidomide baby. He looks a little better. We used to believe that the placenta kept anything from that was bad or toxic from the mother getting into the baby. We now know that isn't the case. It does keep a lot of harmful materials from the baby, but one puff on a cigarette and the baby's heartbeat goes up. So nicotine goes right across. Babies are now born with addiction to heroin if their mothers are addicts. So that the first job the baby has is going through the violent withdrawal symptoms, drying out. There's just lots of babies in hospitals now. So that the drugs, heroin and so on, goes right across the placenta. There are other ways in which the child can be deprived, and that is if there's something wrong with the mother, so that the mother's system requires certain kinds of nutrients, then there won't be any in the mother's blood, or a less amount in the mother's blood, which means the baby won't get it, which means the baby's development may be impaired. Our thesis is that to give every child an equal opportunity in life, he ought to have an intrauterine experience in which his diet, which comes from his mother through the umbilical cord, is absolutely 100% rich and includes every nutrient required. Now let me give you an example of what the deprivation might, what consequences it might have developmentally. You have about 12 to 14 billion nerve cells in just the cortex of the human brain. Just the outer cortex means bark. And the outer layer of the brain is like a bark that covers it. That's why it's called the cerebral cortex. That bark has 12 to 14 billion nerve cells. You are born with a finite number of them. And you don't get any more. They never regenerate. If you lose one, that's it. Ashley Montagu, the anthropologist and physiologist, psychologist, makes the point that it's possible that, say, one cell that is a nerve cell that is going to divide and will have, say, $500 million cells, each of which might multiply twice or 3 or 4 times. Supposing that cell dies because of lack of nutrition